The air on June 20, 2012, was thick and heavy, a typical smothering blanket of summer heat in Havenwood, North Carolina. At the municipal cemetery, the usual silence was broken by the low groan of a backhoe and the clipped, formal voices of town officials. It was supposed to be a day of routine procedure, an exhumation mandated by a new zoning ordinance. The earth, damp and dark, yielded its contents with a reluctant sigh, giving up a casket that had been interred only a few years prior. For the man overseeing the process, this was just another part of the job, a solemn but necessary task in a place where the past was constantly being rearranged to make room for the future. He stood by, watching the mechanical arm lift its burden, his expression unreadable under the shade of his worn baseball cap. That man was Mike Callahan, the cemetery's caretaker. At 40, his movements were deliberate and economical, a reflection of a life spent in quiet observation. He had inherited this role, this guardianship of memories, from a father he barely remembered. The scent of freshly turned soil and wilting flowers was the background noise of his existence, a constant reminder of the place where his own history had fractured. He carried a quiet sorrow that had settled deep into his bones, a permanent resident in the landscape of his soul. His colleagues saw a methodical, reliable man. They didn't see the ghost he walked with among the tombstones, the unanswered question that echoed in the silence between the tolling of the chapel bell. The casket was finally free, swinging gently on thick canvas straps before being lowered onto the grass. It belonged to a Mr. Samuel Peterson, a name on a piece of paper, a man who had died of a heart attack the previous year. To Mike, he was a file, a plot number, another soul whose final rest was being disturbed by bureaucratic necessity. The officials consulted their clipboards, their faces beaded with sweat, eager to conclude the unpleasant task and retreat to the comfort of their air-conditioned offices. Mike approached the wooden box, his hands gloved, his mind focused on the protocol. Ensure dignity, he reminded himself. Respect the vessel, even if the passenger is long gone. The process was cold, detached, and utterly ordinary. With a screech of protesting nails, the lid was pried open. The air inside, stale and still, mingled with the humid afternoon. The officials leaned in, a perfunctory glance to confirm the contents before authorizing the resealing and transport. Mike's gaze, however, lingered. He was trained to notice inconsistencies, a shifted burial shroud, a missing piece of jewelry noted in the records. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't an absence that caught his eye, but a presence. There, resting on the faded satin lining near the deceased's folded hands, was an object that radiated a profound sense of wrongness. It was a dark, foreign shape in a place that should have held nothing but the expected remnants of a life concluded. It was a key, an old, black, wrought-iron key, its head shaped into an ornate, Gothic cross. It was heavy, solid, a relic from another time. But it was the simple, almost childish detail attached to it that made the world around Mike dissolve into a silent roar. Tied around the key's head, in a specific, double-looped knot, was a strip of faded yellow ribbon. The color, a pale lemon yellow, was instantly familiar, a flash of memory so vivid it physically hurt. It was a signal, a secret language he hadn't seen or thought of in 28 years. A symbol that belonged to only one person, a man who had vanished long ago, leaving behind nothing but the echo of his name and a legacy of unanswered questions. The scene dissolved. September 13, 1984. Rain lashed against the windows of the small caretaker's cottage, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. A 12-year-old Mike watched his father, Thomas Callahan, pull on his heavy rain slicker. By the door, Thomas grabbed a handful of wooden stakes and a spool of yellow ribbon. He tied a strip to each stake with that same peculiar knot. "Hurricane's going to make a mess of things," Thomas had said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm's chaos. "This way I can mark any graves that get damaged or flooded, so I don't forget which ones need my help." He smiled, ruffled Mike's hair, and walked out into the tempest. It was the last time Mike ever saw him. The official story was clean, tragic, and simple. Thomas Callahan, a devoted caretaker, was caught in the flash floods while securing the cemetery grounds. His truck was found near the swollen creek a day later, but his body was never recovered. He was declared a victim of the hurricane, a good man lost to the indifferent fury of nature. The town erected a small bronze plaque in his honor near the chapel he had so diligently maintained. But for his family, the story was a wound that never closed. Without a body, there was no grave to visit, no final place to mourn. There was only the storm, the empty space at the dinner table, and the lingering, unspoken belief that the truth had been washed away with him. Back in the oppressive heat of 2012, the sounds of the cemetery rushed back into Mike's ears. The impatient cough of a town official, the buzzing of a fly, the distant hum of traffic, none of it registered. His entire being was focused on that key. He knew it not just by the ribbon, but by its very shape. It was the master key to the old cemetery chapel, a key his father had carried with him every single day. For 28 years, that key had been missing, presumed lost in the flood along with the man who carried it. Now it had reappeared. Not in the silt of the creek bed or in some forgotten corner of the woods, but sealed inside the coffin of a complete stranger. This was no accident. This was not a misplaced item. It was a message, deliberately planted and carefully preserved, a silent communication from beyond the veil of time. The man in the casket, Samuel Peterson, had been the messenger, but the author of this final, cryptic correspondence was his father. The yellow ribbon was not just a memory, it was a beacon. It signaled that the official story, the one the town had accepted for nearly 3 decades, was a lie. A deep, cold certainty settled over Mike, displacing the sorrow that had been his constant companion. This key wasn't just iron and rust, it was the start of a story. And he finally understood that his life's work wasn't just to tend to the dead, but to find the truth of how one of them got that way. The world contracted to a single point of focus, the black iron key resting in the casket. For a suspended moment, all sound ceased. The humid air, the drone of insects, the impatient shuffling of the town officials, it all vanished, replaced by the frantic, percussive beat of Mike Callahan's own heart against his ribs. His gloved hand trembled as he reached down, his fingers closing around the cold, heavy metal. The texture was rough, ancient, and disturbingly familiar. It felt less like an object, and more like a memory given physical form, a ghost from the past reaching out to touch him. The weight of it in his palm was immense, a gravity far exceeding its size, pulling him back through 28 years of carefully constructed silence and unanswered questions. His mind, usually so orderly and methodical, became a maelstrom of denial and recognition. It couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a cruel trick of light and memory. Someone else could have used a yellow ribbon. Someone else could have owned a similar key. But the knot, that specific, double-looped knot, was a signature. It was the way his father, Thomas, had tied everything, from the laces on his work boots to the strings on a kite. It was a small, insignificant piece of muscle memory that Mike had watched 1,000 times, a detail so personal and ingrained that seeing it here, in this impossible place, felt like a violation. It was his father's handwriting, scrawled not in ink, but in ribbon and iron. A sharp, throat-clearing sound from one of the officials, a portly man named Henderson, shattered his trance. "Everything all right, Callahan? Is that something we need to log?" The question was a lifeline, pulling Mike back to the sweltering heat of the present. He had to think. He had to act. His mind screamed that this object was the most important thing he had ever touched, a piece of evidence in a crime that had gone unsolved for nearly 3 decades. He couldn't let them take it, catalog it, and bury it in some forgotten evidence locker. A primal, protective instinct surged through him, a sudden and fierce need to shield this discovery from the indifferent eyes of bureaucracy. This was his, and his alone. With a speed that surprised even himself, Mike's hand closed around the key and slipped it into the deep pocket of his work pants. The movement was fluid, almost a sleight of hand, concealed by the angle of his body as he leaned over the casket. Just a personal effect, he mumbled, his voice sounding distant and hoarse to his own ears. Looks like it was missed. I'll make sure it gets to the records office with the rest of Mr. Peterson's belongings. The lie felt foreign on his tongue, yet it came out with a conviction born of desperation. He kept his eyes down, focusing on a loose thread on the casket's satin lining, praying they wouldn't see the storm raging behind his calm facade. The officials, their minds already on paperwork and the promise of air conditioning, accepted his explanation without a second glance. Their job was done. The casket was resealed with a series of dull thuds. The unpleasant task concluded. As they turned away, their conversation immediately shifting to lunch plans and town gossip, Mike felt a profound sense of detachment. He was standing on a precipice, and the entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. For them, this was just another Tuesday. For him, this was the day his life had fractured into two distinct periods: the long, quiet years before he found the key, and the terrifying, uncertain future that had just begun. The ordinary world had fallen away. As he watched the municipal truck carry Samuel Peterson's coffin to its new resting place, a single question began to burn through the fog of his shock. Who was this man? He was a complete stranger, a name on a death certificate, a man who had died peacefully in his sleep. Yet, somehow, this ordinary man had become the messenger for an extraordinary secret. He was the vessel, the postman from the past, delivering a package that had been in transit for 28 years. How did he come to possess his father's key? Was he a friend? An enemy? Or just a random soul chosen to carry this burden? The mystery of Samuel Peterson was now inextricably linked to his father's. The key in his pocket felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric, a constant, physical reminder of the impossible thing he had just seen. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the distilled essence of every question that had haunted his family. It was the weight of a missing body, the silence of a town that moved on too quickly, and the quiet ache of a son who grew up in the shadow of a ghost. The key was a promise of answers, but it was also a profound threat. It threatened the fragile peace he had mistaken for a life, the quiet routine he had used to numb the pain. To turn this key was to unlock a past that others had clearly wanted to remain sealed forever. He walked back toward the small caretaker's cottage, his boots crunching on the gravel path with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud. The cemetery, his sanctuary of silence and order, now felt like a hostile landscape. Every weathered angel statue seemed to be watching him, every weeping willow whispering secrets he couldn't understand. The familiar rows of tombstones, which had once offered a sense of continuity and peace, now looked like a field of buried lies. He had spent his adult life tending to this place, believing he knew its every corner, its every story, but he realized now that he had only been skimming the surface. The real history of Havenwood Cemetery was written in a language he was only just beginning to understand. Inside the dusty office of the cottage, he finally dared to retrieve the key from his pocket. He placed it carefully on the worn surface of his father's old oak desk, the same desk he now used every day. The dark, rusted iron stood in stark contrast to the polished wood. The yellow ribbon, brittle and faded, seemed to glow with an inner light. He reached out a hesitant finger and traced the outline of the Gothic cross, then the faded fabric of the knot. In that single touch, the years collapsed. He was a boy again, safe in this very cottage, watching his father tie that same knot, his strong, capable hands moving with a practiced ease that Mike had always admired. The truth of it settled over him, cold and absolute. This was not a coincidence. This was a message. It had been deliberately planted, a time capsule of truth waiting for the right moment, the right person, to unearth it. His father, Thomas Callahan, had not been a victim of a hurricane's random fury. He hadn't been swept away by floodwaters. He had been silenced, And this key was the first word of the story he was never allowed to tell. The official report, the bronze plaque, the town's collective convenient memory, it was all a carefully constructed lie. And the proof, the undeniable, physical proof, was now lying on his father's desk, waiting for him. A new feeling began to displace the shock and the deep, familiar sorrow. It was a cold, hard resolve, settling deep in his bones. The grief that had been a dull, constant ache for 28 years began to sharpen, to crystallize into something that felt like purpose. He was no longer just the passive inheritor of his father's job, a man simply going through the motions in a life defined by absence. He was now the keeper of his father's last testament. His work was no longer about tending to the dead. It was about finding justice for one of them. He would follow where this key led, no matter how dark the path became, or who had worked so hard to bury it. Before the key, before the exhumation, there was only the story. The official story. In 1984, Havenwood, North Carolina, was a town that prided itself on simple virtues, hard work, church on Sundays, and a deep respect for its history. Thomas Callahan was the living embodiment of that history. As the caretaker of the municipal cemetery, he was more than just a groundskeeper. He was the town's quiet historian, the guardian of its collective memory. He knew the stories behind every headstone, the lineage of every family plot. He was a man of immense integrity, known for his steady hands and his calming presence in times of grief. To the people of Havenwood, Thomas wasn't just an employee. He was a fixture, a comforting constant in a world that was constantly changing, as reliable as the ancient oaks that shaded the cemetery grounds. Life in the small caretaker's cottage on the edge of the cemetery was idyllic for young Mike. It was a world defined by the scent of freshly cut grass, the distant toll of the chapel bell, and the comforting rumble of his father's pickup truck returning at dusk. Thomas was a gentle but firm presence, a man who taught his son how to mend a fence, identify constellations, and treat the departed with dignity. Their home was a sanctuary, insulated from the sorrow that lay just beyond their garden gate. For Mike, the cemetery was not a place of fear, but an extension of his backyard, a peaceful kingdom over which his father reigned with quiet authority. It was a life of profound stability, built on the bedrock of a father's love and the predictable rhythms of a small southern town. That bedrock shattered on the night of September 13, 1984. A hurricane, a monstrous, swirling beast of wind and rain, descended upon Havenwood with a fury the town had never witnessed. As the storm raged, Thomas Callahan did what he always did. He went to work. He told his wife he needed to secure loose headstones and clear drainage ditches to prevent the older, more fragile parts of the cemetery from flooding. It was an act of pure devotion, a man protecting his charge even as nature tried to tear it apart. He ventured into the tempest, a lone figure against the elements, driven by a sense of duty that would ultimately become his epitaph. The official narrative wrote itself. A good man, a dedicated caretaker, lost his life while protecting the town's sacred ground. The search in the storm's aftermath was a grim, desperate affair. Volunteers from all over the county combed the ravaged landscape, their calls swallowed by the sodden, silent woods. They found his truck, mired in mud near the banks of the overflowing creek, its driver's side door eerily ajar. But of Thomas, there was no sign. The floodwaters had been powerful, a churning torrent of debris and earth, and the conclusion was swift and unanimous. He had been swept away, his body likely carried miles downstream or buried under a mountain of silt. The town mourned, erected a bronze plaque in his honor, and slowly began to rebuild. For Havenwood, the story had a tragic but clean ending. For the Callahan family, it was a wound that refused to close, an endless, agonizing question mark. Growing up, Mike lived in the long shadow of that question mark. His father became a local legend, a martyr to his own dedication, but at home, he was a ghost, an absence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Without a body, there was no grave to visit, no focal point for their grief. There was only the story, repeated by well-meaning neighbors until it became a hollow, meaningless mantra. This ambiguity shaped Mike's entire existence, instilling in him a deep-seated need for order and certainty in a life that had been defined by their lack. He became quiet, observant, and introspective, a boy who learned early on that the world could take away the most important things without warning or explanation, leaving nothing but memories and a story that never felt quite true. It surprised everyone, most of all himself, when Mike took the caretaker job 20 years later. It wasn't a conscious choice to follow in his father's footsteps, but rather a gravitational pull he couldn't resist. He was drawn back to the one place on earth that held the last tangible evidence of his father's existence. His days fell into a methodical, almost meditative rhythm, trimming the hedges, polishing the brass plaques, tending to the flower beds. Each task was a small act of control, a way to impose a quiet order on the chaotic memory of his loss. The cemetery became his world, a self-imposed exile where he could feel close to his father without having to confront the painful mystery of his disappearance. He was a sentinel, guarding a past he didn't fully understand. By 2012, Havenwood had changed. The sleepy town Mike remembered had grown, its prosperity fueled by new developments and the shrewd investments of its long-standing leaders, men like former Mayor Warren Bishop. Bishop was a pillar of the community, a charismatic patriarch who had guided Havenwood from the wreckage of the 1984 hurricane into a new era of growth. He was universally respected, his name synonymous with the town's success. The storm that had taken Mike's father had, in a strange way, become a foundational myth for the modern Havenwood, a trial by fire from which it had emerged stronger than ever. The past was a closed book, a story of tragedy overcome by resilience, and no one seemed interested in reading it again. On the morning of the exhumation, Mike Callahan was a man living in a carefully constructed peace. At 40, he had accepted his lot. He was the quiet caretaker, a man defined by his job, his life a steady, predictable current. The deep, aching sorrow of his childhood had subsided into a dull, constant hum in the background of his life. He believed he had made peace with the official story, with the tragic, random act of nature that had stolen his father. He moved through the rows of tombstones, a familiar and solitary figure, unaware that he was standing at the edge of a precipice. He was the guardian of 1,000 secrets buried beneath the soil, never imagining that the most important one was his own, waiting for a simple iron key to finally be unearthed. Warren Bishop was the architect of modern Havenwood. At 75, he possessed the regal air of a man who had not only witnessed history, but had personally sculpted it. He had been the town's mayor in 1984, a charismatic leader who guided his flock through the devastation of the hurricane with a steady hand and a reassuring smile. In the decades that followed, his investments in local development turned the storm-ravaged town into a model of small-town prosperity. To the public, he was a benevolent patriarch, his name etched onto the library and the new community center. But beneath the veneer of civic duty was a man of ruthless pragmatism, one who understood that progress often required inconvenient truths to be permanently buried. His power was absolute, woven into the very fabric of the town he had rebuilt in his own image. Where Bishop was the charismatic mind, Sheriff Brody had been the iron fist. The town's police chief in 1984, now a grizzled retiree, often seen holding court at the local diner, Brody was a man of few words and decisive action. His loyalty to Warren Bishop was legendary, a bond forged in the chaotic aftermath of the hurricane. He was the enforcer, the one who ensured the mayor's vision for Havenwood was never compromised by dissent or inconvenient questions. Even in retirement, his presence cast a long shadow over the local law enforcement that had replaced him. He represented the old guard, a walking reminder that some secrets were protected not just by silence, but by a palpable, lingering threat of force. He was the gatekeeper of Bishop's past, and his watchful eyes missed nothing. Thomas Callahan, in stark contrast, had been a man of the earth. His integrity was as solid and unyielding as the granite headstones he tended. He wasn't just an employee. He was a custodian of stories, a man who believed the cemetery was a sacred trust. He knew that the land held more than just bodies. It held the town's soul. Friends remembered him as meticulously honest, a man who would notice if a single flower was out of place. It was this very nature, his unwavering attention to detail and his deep moral connection to the grounds, that made him a liability. He had discovered that Bishop and Brody were not just developing the town but exploiting it, using the cemetery's periphery for illicit land deals, a desecration he could never ignore. Living on the edge of town, in a small house filled with faded photographs and the scent of lavender, was Evelyn May. At 80, her memories were a fractured mosaic, pieces of the past that surfaced without warning. She had been a close friend of Mike's mother, a constant source of quiet support in the years after Thomas vanished. Now, she was mostly seen as a sweet but confused old woman, her stories often dismissed as the ramblings of age. Yet within that fragmented mind lay a single, crystal-clear image from the night of the hurricane, a memory so terrifying that she had locked it away for nearly 3 decades. She represented the town's conscience, a fragile vessel holding a truth too heavy for one person to carry alone, terrified of the consequences of speaking it aloud. The Havenwood of 2012 was a town that had made a pact with its past. It would not speak of it. The prosperity was too comfortable, the new life too pleasant, to risk digging up old ghosts. The downtown area boasted renovated storefronts, a bustling farmer's market, and a sense of community pride that felt genuine. Yet, the municipal cemetery remained on the outskirts, an almost forgotten relic of a time before the boom. It was a place people visited out of obligation, a quiet, orderly landscape that belied the chaotic secret it held. The town's new identity was built directly atop the crime that had enabled it, a success story with a dark, unread prologue that everyone had tacitly agreed to forget. The peace was real, but it was conditional. This collective amnesia stood in stark contrast to Mike Callahan's life, which had been defined by memory. While Havenwood grew and changed, Mike remained emotionally frozen in 1984. Taking the caretaker job wasn't a choice but a compulsion, a subconscious need to stand watch over the last place his father had existed. He moved through his days in a state of quiet penance, his life a monotonous loop of routine tasks. He was an observer, a man on the outside looking in, even in his own hometown. His colleagues saw him as reliable and solitary, never suspecting that his quiet demeanor was a shield, protecting a deep and unresolved grief that had shaped every decision he had ever made. He was a ghost haunting his own life, just as his father haunted the cemetery. An unspoken rule governed Havenwood. Local problems were handled locally. The town's police force, many of whom owed their careers to Sheriff Brody's recommendation or Warren Bishop's influence, operated within a well-understood hierarchy. They kept the peace, managed petty crimes, and, most importantly, knew which doors were never to be knocked upon. This insular system meant that any truly disruptive investigation would have to come from the outside. The State Bureau of Investigation, headquartered in the state capital, was a distant and abstract threat, an entity that only got involved when a local situation became too loud to ignore. The arrival of an SBI detective like Sarah Jenkins would be more than an investigation. It would be an invasion, a violation of the town's carefully guarded sovereignty. The climate before the exhumation was therefore one of a carefully maintained yet fragile equilibrium. Warren Bishop was the revered king, Brody his loyal knight, and the townspeople the contented subjects of a prosperous kingdom. The story of Thomas Callahan was a foundational myth of sacrifice, a tragic but necessary chapter in the town's heroic rise from the ashes. Mike existed as a quiet, living memorial to that myth, his presence a constant but non-threatening reminder. Everything was in its proper place. The secrets were secure, the power structure was solid, and the past was a settled matter. But beneath the manicured lawns and peaceful facades, the truth lay dormant, waiting for the turning of a single, rusted key to shatter the silence. The weight of the key in his pocket was a constant, burning reminder of the day's impossible turn. Back in the solitude of the caretaker's cottage, Mike finally laid the object on the worn surface of his father's old oak desk. Under the weak glow of a single desk lamp, the wrought iron seemed to absorb the light, a small piece of darkness in the quiet room. The faded yellow ribbon was a stark, almost accusatory splash of color against the rust. He traced the double-looped knot with his fingertip, a gesture he had seen his father make 1,000 times. In that moment, the official story of a tragic accident didn't just feel wrong. It felt like a deliberate, carefully constructed lie. He knew he couldn't go to the police. Not yet. This was a message intended for him, and he had to be the one to follow its first thread. He waited for the moon to rise, for the last of the town's lights to be extinguished one by one. The cemetery at night was a different entity, a place he thought he knew intimately but now saw with new eyes. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. Every gust of wind through the weeping willows sounded like a whisper. He moved with a practiced silence along the gravel paths, the key clutched tightly in his hand. This was a transgression. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the guardian of this place, but a trespasser, an investigator, moving through his own crime scene. The familiar scent of damp earth and cut grass was now tinged with the metallic odor of secrets, and the air itself felt heavy with the weight of 28 years of silence, a pressure building against his chest with every step he took. His destination was the old stone chapel at the heart of the cemetery. Its Gothic spire was a black finger pointing at a starless sky. He remembered his father telling him stories about it, about how the master key opened more than just the heavy oak doors. It was the key to the cemetery's entire history. He stood before the main entrance, the iron lock plate tarnished with age. With a trembling hand, he inserted the key. It slid into the lock with a disquieting ease, a perfect fit after decades of absence. He turned it, and the sound of the old tumbler shifting and aligning echoed loudly in the profound stillness of the night. With a deep, resonant click, the lock disengaged. The door swung inward on groaning hinges, revealing a cavern of absolute darkness. Inside, the air was stale and cold, thick with the dust of forgotten sermons. Moonlight filtered weakly through the tall, arched, stained glass windows, painting fractured colors on the stone floor. But Mike wasn't there for the chapel itself. He was chasing a ghost, a fragmented memory from his childhood. His father had once pointed toward the far back wall of the cemetery, a section long since abandoned and overgrown with kudzu and thorny bushes. The old grounds, Thomas had called it. A place for stories no one tells anymore. He'd said there was a gate back there, sealed with a special padlock, a lock that only this chapel key could open. Mike moved through the chapel and out a small side door, his flashlight beam cutting a nervous path toward the cemetery's dark, forgotten edge. He found the gate exactly where his memory had placed it, though it was barely recognizable. It was less a gate and more a tangle of rusted iron and aggressive, thick-stemmed ivy that had woven itself through the bars, effectively merging it with the surrounding wilderness. Hanging from the latch was a heavy, disc-shaped padlock, its surface a solid mass of orange and brown corrosion. For a heart-stopping moment, doubt washed over him. This was insane. The lock looked as if it hadn't been touched since the Civil War. It was a fool's errand, a son's desperate attempt to rewrite a history that was already set in stone. He almost turned back, ready to dismiss the key as a cruel coincidence, a final, meaningless echo from the past. But the weight of the key in his hand urged him forward. He jammed it into the padlock's keyhole, the metal grinding against layers of hardened rust. It wouldn't turn. He pushed harder, using both hands, his knuckles scraping against the corroded surface. He put his shoulder into it, gritting his teeth as a sharp, grating screech of metal on metal cut through the night. The sound was agonizing, like a scream being torn from the rusted iron. Then, just as he was about to give up, there was a sudden, jarring release. A loud, definitive click echoed through the trees. The shackle of the padlock sprang open with a final sigh of protest. A wave of cold, musty air, thick with the smell of decay and stagnant water, washed over him from the darkness beyond. He pushed the gate open, its hinges shrieking in protest, and stepped into a part of the cemetery that had been erased from the town's memory. It was a chaotic jumble of tilted headstones and sunken plots, all of it under a thick canopy of ancient, gnarled trees that blocked out the moonlight. The air was heavy and still. He swept his flashlight beam across the scene, illuminating weathered angels with missing wings and stone lambs covered in moss. This was a place of profound neglect, a testament to how easily the dead could be forgotten. He felt a deep, primal fear, the sense that he was treading on forbidden ground, but it was overshadowed by an even stronger feeling. He was getting closer. He was walking in his father's final footsteps. And then his light found it. In a small, unnaturally clear patch of ground, surrounded by the chaos of the overgrowth, was a subtle but unmistakable depression in the earth. It was a perfect rectangle, roughly 6 feet by 3, where the soil had settled differently over time. There was no headstone, no cross, no marker of any kind. It was a void, a deliberate emptiness in a place filled with names and dates. Anyone else would have walked right past it, dismissing it as a natural feature of the uneven ground. But Mike knew. He knew the meticulous way his father had cared for every plot, every grave. This was the opposite of his father's work. This wasn't a forgotten grave. This was a hidden one. And he knew, with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins, who was buried inside. The flashlight beam trembled in Mike's hand, the circle of light dancing over the sunken rectangle of earth. This was it. The cold, hard certainty of it settled in his gut like a block of ice. There was no headstone, no name, just a silent, damning indentation in the soil. For 28 years his father had been a ghost, a story, a bronze plaque by the chapel door. But he hadn't been lost to the flood. He had been here all along, less than 100 yards from the cottage where his family waited, buried in unconsecrated ground like a shameful secret. A wave of nausea and a profound, bone-deep sorrow washed over Mike, so intense it almost brought him to his knees. The quiet caretaker, the dutiful son, vanished in that moment, replaced by a man staring into his own family's open grave. The truth of a long-hidden murder finally laid bare before him. He knew he couldn't call Sheriff Miller, the current chief of Havenwood Police, and a man who had been Sheriff Brody's protege. An instinct, sharp and primal, warned him against it. The key, the hidden grave. This was not a simple crime. It was a conspiracy, one that had been protected by the town's silence for nearly 3 decades. Local law enforcement was part of that silence, whether through complicity or willful ignorance. He needed an outsider, someone with no loyalties to Havenwood, no connection to Warren Bishop or the Old Guard. He needed someone who would see a crime, not an inconvenience to the town's carefully crafted history. He retreated from the overgrown section of the cemetery, his mind racing, the image of that sunken earth burned into his memory. He walked back not to his cottage, but to the payphone outside the town's all-night diner, a relic from an era he was now forced to confront. From the relative anonymity of the glass booth under the flickering fluorescent light of the diner's sign, he dialed the number for the State Bureau of Investigation in the state capital. When a dispatcher answered, Mike kept his voice low and steady, forcing the emotion out of it. He reported an anonymous tip, the discovery of what appeared to be an unmarked, clandestine grave on the grounds of the Havenwood Municipal Cemetery. He gave precise directions to the forgotten section, describing the rusted gate and the overgrown path. He provided no name, no context, only the cold, hard facts. He hung up before the dispatcher could ask any more questions, the click of the receiver sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet night. He had just lit a fuse, one that would burn straight to the heart of Havenwood's most powerful figures. There was no going back now. By dawn, the cemetery was no longer his quiet sanctuary. It had become a formal crime scene. 2 unmarked sedans and a white SBI forensics van were parked near the chapel, their official presence a stark intrusion on the hallowed ground. A team of investigators, led by a sharp, no-nonsense detective in her mid-30s named Sarah Jenkins, moved with a quiet, methodical efficiency. They sectioned off the area with yellow tape, the bright color a jarring contrast to the muted greens and grays of the old tombstones. Mike watched from a distance, standing near his father's bronze plaque, feeling like a stranger in the only home he had ever known. Detective Jenkins approached him, her eyes missing nothing. "You the caretaker? Mike Callahan?" she asked. He simply nodded, the lie of his anonymous tip already feeling thin. She knew. Or she would soon enough. The exhumation began under the oppressive morning sun. The forensic team worked with a detached professionalism that was both comforting and chilling. They photographed the site from every angle, took soil samples, and carefully cleared away the overgrowth around the sunken rectangle of earth. Every step was deliberate, catalogued, and devoid of the raw emotion that was churning inside Mike. He watched as they began to dig, not with a backhoe's brute force, but with hand trowels and brushes, scraping away the layers of time with a surgeon's precision. With each scoop of dirt removed, his breath caught in his throat, he was watching them unearth his childhood, his history, the final violent moments of his father's life. The scent of the damp soil was the same scent that had always meant comfort and routine. Now it smelled of death and deceit. Hours later, their careful work yielded its grim reward. A spade struck something solid, and the digging became even more delicate. Slowly, painfully, they uncovered the skeletal remains of a man, laid to rest without a casket, wrapped only in what looked like a tattered canvas tarp. The bones were stained dark by the rich North Carolina soil. The team documented the position of the body, the few remaining scraps of denim and flannel clinging to the skeleton, and a pair of worn leather work boots, the laces still tied in a familiar double-looped knot. Mike felt the world tilt on its axis. He didn't need a DNA test. He didn't need dental records. He knew those boots. He knew that knot. He was looking at the last remnants of his father, Thomas Callahan, exactly as he had been on that stormy night in 1984. As one of the technicians carefully brushed dirt away from the skeleton's torso, her tool made a soft metallic sound. "Hold on," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet focus of the team. "I've got something here." Tucked inside the remnants of what would have been a shirt pocket, nestled against the rib cage, was a small, rectangular object. It was a tin box, the kind used for tobacco or mints, its surface almost completely obscured by rust and corrosion. It was sealed tight, preserved by the packed earth around it. Detective Jenkins knelt, her expression shifting from professional interest to sharp, focused intensity. This was not a personal trinket. In a clandestine grave, an object like this was a message, a final statement left by the victim. It was evidence, deliberately saved, waiting for someone to find it. Later that afternoon, the preliminary report from the medical examiner on site delivered the final, devastating blow to the official story. The skeleton was consistent with a male of Thomas Callahan's age and approximate height. But the cause of death was not drowning. The examiner pointed to a series of fractures on the skull, clear evidence of multiple impacts from a heavy, blunt object. Thomas Callahan had been murdered, struck down from behind with brutal force before being dragged to this forgotten corner and buried. The hurricane hadn't been the killer. It had been the perfect cover. As Detective Jenkins carefully placed the sealed tin box into an evidence bag, Mike understood. The key had unlocked the grave. This box, he prayed, would unlock the names of the men who had put his father in it. The investigation had just truly begun. The SBI forensics lab in the state capitol operated with a sterile, impersonal efficiency that felt worlds away from the humid earth of Havenwood Cemetery. Under the harsh glare of laboratory lights, a technician used a specialized cutting tool to carefully slice through the corroded seal of the small tin box. The process was slow and methodical, each movement precise, recorded by a high-definition camera. For Detective Sarah Jenkins, watching from behind a glass partition, the anticipation was a physical pressure in her chest. This box was a ghost's final testament, a message sealed for 28 years. When the lid was finally pried open, it revealed its contents not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, solemn dignity. Nestled inside, protected by a layer of oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound ledger, its pages yellowed with age but miraculously intact, preserved against the damp and the dark. The ledger was carefully transported to an examination room, its fragility demanding the utmost care. Jenkins and a document specialist donned white gloves to handle the artifact. The leather cover was worn smooth in places, and the pages were brittle, threatening to crumble at the slightest mishandling. The ink, a faded sepia, was written in a neat, meticulous hand that Mike Callahan would have instantly recognized as his father's. The pages were filled not with prose or diary entries, but with columns of cryptic information. Dates from the spring and summer of 1984, a series of initials, and long strings of numbers. It was immediately clear that this was no personal journal. It was a record, a secret accounting of transactions that Thomas Callahan had deemed important enough to document and hide, a final, damning piece of evidence he left behind in his own makeshift tomb. Jenkins and Mike sat across from each other at a table in the temporary command post set up near the cemetery, the high-resolution photographs of the ledger's pages spread between them. The initial attempts at decryption were deeply frustrating. The initials, WB, SB, RT, were meaningless without context. The numbers didn't match any known bank accounts, property deeds, or public records from that era. They were chasing ghosts in a numerical fog. For hours, they hit one dead end after another. The feeling of being so close to the truth, yet unable to grasp it, was agonizing. The code, created by a man nearly 3 decades ago, was a formidable fortress. It seemed as if Thomas Callahan's secret might have been buried so effectively that it would remain locked away forever, a final, bitter irony. The breakthrough came late that night, back in the quiet solitude of the caretaker's cottage. Surrounded by his father's old belongings, faded maps, work logs, and planting schedules, Mike felt a sudden, electric jolt of insight. He was looking at an old, hand-drawn plat map of the cemetery grounds, its grid system marked with a unique alphanumeric code his father had devised for tracking maintenance. He grabbed the photos of the ledger and began comparing the numbers. They were a perfect match. The long strings of numbers weren't financial data. They were plot coordinates. His father hadn't been tracking money. He had been using the gravesites themselves as the key to his code, a chillingly brilliant method of hiding his investigation in plain sight, using the very ground he was sworn to protect as his secret filing cabinet. With this new key, the ledger's secrets began to bleed onto the page. Mike and Jenkins worked feverishly, cross-referencing the plot numbers from the ledger with the old cemetery maps and the town's property records from 1984. A disturbing pattern emerged with stark clarity. The gravesites his father had meticulously logged were all located on the far edges of the cemetery, directly adjacent to parcels of land that had been controversially rezoned for commercial development. These were the very projects that had fueled Warren Bishop's rise to power, transforming him from a small-town mayor into a wealthy real estate magnate. The cemetery wasn't just the burial site for Thomas Callahan. It was the epicenter of the entire criminal enterprise he had uncovered, a silent witness to the town's foundational sins. The initials now snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. WB appeared next to the largest and most audacious land deals, Warren Bishop. SB, his ever-present shadow, was listed on entries detailing intimidation and coercion, Sheriff Brody. The ledger was a meticulous, damning account of a massive corruption scheme. Bishop and Brody had been using their power to acquire land cheaply, using the cemetery's borders as a front for their illicit transactions, and burying the kickbacks in a complex web of shell companies. Thomas Callahan, The honest caretaker who knew every inch of that land had stumbled upon their secret. He hadn't just seen a crime. He had discovered the rotten core of Havenwood's prosperity, and for that, he had been permanently silenced. Word of an SBI investigation into an unidentified body found at the cemetery spread through Havenwood like a contagion. Warren Bishop, a man who had built an empire on his ability to control information, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He arranged what he passed off as a casual encounter with Mike at the local diner, sliding into the booth opposite him with a practiced, paternalistic smile. He spoke of the town's difficult past, of the hurricane, and of the need for healing. He offered his condolences for the reopening of old wounds. But beneath the syrupy words was a core of cold steel. "Some things are best left in the past, son," Bishop said, his eyes holding Mike's gaze. "Your father was a good man, but he didn't understand progress. Don't make the same mistake." It wasn't advice. It was a threat. The encounter solidified Detective Jenkins' resolve. This was no longer a cold case. It was a live confrontation with a powerful and dangerous adversary. She knew that Bishop would now begin pulling strings, using his influence to obstruct and intimidate. She had to move quickly, to build a case strong enough to withstand the political storm that was coming. She advised Mike to stay away from Bishop and to let her handle the formal interviews, warning him that he was now a direct threat to men who had already proven they were capable of murder. Her strategy was clear. Start with the weakest link. She would pay a visit to the retired Sheriff Brody, a man who had lived for decades in Bishop's shadow, and see just how loyal he remained when faced with a murder charge. Sheriff Brody's home was a modest brick rancher, a picture of quiet retirement. But the man who answered the door was anything but peaceful. He was a wall of belligerent denial, his face a mask of contempt. He repeated the official hurricane story with a bored, rehearsed cadence, dismissing Jenkins's questions with a wave of his hand. He portrayed Thomas Callahan as a stubborn fool who had gotten himself killed through his own recklessness. But when Jenkins mentioned that the body was found in the old, abandoned section of the cemetery, a detail she had deliberately withheld from the public, she saw it. A flicker of panic in his eyes, a slight tightening of his jaw. It was the first crack in the decades-old wall of silence, a sign that beneath the bluster, the retired sheriff was running scared. While Jenkins pursued the official channels, Mike felt an undeniable pull toward Evelyn May. He remembered her from his childhood as a kind, gentle woman, but in the weeks after his father's disappearance, her grief had been laced with a palpable terror that even a young boy could sense. He found her tending her garden, her hands trembling as she snipped at her rose bushes. When he gently brought up the night of the hurricane, a veil of fear fell over her face. She refused to speak, her eyes darting nervously toward the street. "You don't know what you're stirring up," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "They were powerful men. They still are." She wouldn't say who they were, but her terror was a testimony in itself. Evelyn May had seen something that night, a truth she had carried like a poison for 28 years. The investigation had now escalated dramatically. The secret of the ledger had transformed the case from a singular tragic murder into a sprawling conspiracy that implicated the very men who had built modern Havenwood. Warren Bishop and Sheriff Brody were no longer historical figures in a cold case. They were active antagonists, aware that the past was closing in on them. Mike Callahan, once a quiet caretaker living in the shadow of his father's ghost, was now the central catalyst in a dangerous conflict, his every move watched. The fragile peace of the town had been shattered, and the stakes were no longer just about uncovering the truth. They were about survival. Jenkins and Mike were not just investigating a crime. They were challenging a dynasty built on a secret buried in an unmarked grave. Detective Jenkins, a firm believer that money leaves a clearer trail than memory, redirected her focus from witness intimidation to the cold, hard numbers in Thomas Callahan's ledger. She began the painstaking process of pulling every financial and property record related to the land parcels Thomas had so carefully logged. This was the unglamorous, methodical core of police work, a world of microfiche, dusty archive boxes, and endless digital databases. She was building a case brick by brick, tracing the flow of money from the rezoned properties back through the years. She knew Warren Bishop was too smart to have his name on anything incriminating, so she wasn't looking for him. She was looking for the cracks, the small, seemingly insignificant names of the people he used to build his empire, the ones who could be leveraged or broken. This was a war of attrition, and she intended to win it with paperwork. Her diligence paid off in a dusty file from the county clerk's office. The records detailed a complex web of shell corporations and straw buyers, a deliberate and confusing maze designed to obscure the true ownership of the land Bishop had acquired. Most of the names were phantoms, identities that led to empty post office boxes or defunct legal entities. But one name, on a minor land transfer document dated August 1984, made her pause. It was Samuel Peterson, the man from the exhumed casket. He had been paid a modest sum of $500 to act as a temporary signatory on a deed that was later absorbed by one of Bishop's primary development companies. The connection was no longer a vague spiritual mystery. It was a direct, documented financial link. Peterson wasn't a random messenger. He was a participant, a cog in the machine that had crushed Thomas Callahan. Jenkins immediately shared the finding with Mike, who stared at the copy of the deed in disbelief. Samuel Peterson. He remembered the man as a quiet, almost invisible figure in Havenwood, a handyman who lived alone and kept to himself. The thought of him being involved in a high-stakes corruption scheme seemed utterly preposterous. But the evidence was undeniable. It recontextualized everything. Peterson's final act of placing the key in his own coffin wasn't just a random act of conscience. It was a specific, targeted confession. He had been an accomplice, perhaps a reluctant one, who lived with his guilt for 28 years and used his own death to deliver the one piece of evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. The key was his apology, his attempt at redemption from beyond the grave, and it deepened the tragedy of both his life and his death. The news that the SBI had established a direct link between the murder and the town's foundational land deals spread through Havenwood's gossip network, finally reaching Evelyn May. The official investigation, combined with Mike's gentle but persistent visits, became a weight her conscience could no longer bear. The fear that had kept her silent for nearly 3 decades was finally eclipsed by the crushing guilt of her inaction. One evening she called Mike, her voice a fragile, trembling whisper on the other end of the line. "I need to talk," she said, the words catching in her throat. "I can't carry it anymore, Michael. What I saw that night, it was wrong. I should have said something then." It was the breakthrough they had been desperately waiting for, the moment a human voice was about to confirm what the ledger only hinted at. Seated in her immaculate living room, with Detective Jenkins recording her statement, Evelyn May finally unburdened her soul. She recounted the night of the hurricane, the wind howling so fiercely it rattled the window panes. Her house, situated on a small rise, had a clear, if distant view of the cemetery's main service road. Through the driving rain, illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, she saw 2 vehicles turn onto the cemetery road, heading not toward the main grounds, but toward the old, abandoned section. One was Warren Bishop's unmistakable Lincoln Town car, a symbol of his status even then. The other was the official, boxy form of Sheriff Brody's police truck. They were the last 2 people she saw go up that road before Thomas Callahan was declared missing. Her testimony shattered the official narrative that Thomas had been alone that night. Her voice dropped to a near whisper as she described what came next. Perhaps an hour later, over the constant roar of the storm, she heard a sound. It was a sharp, yet muffled noise, a dull and heavy thud that was distinct from the crack of falling branches. She described it as a sickening, unnatural sound that made the hair on her arms stand up. At the time, she had tried to convince herself it was just the storm, a tree limb striking a hollow log. But deep down, a cold dread had settled in her heart. She never saw Bishop's Lincoln or Brody's truck come back down the road that night, at least not before she finally fell into a fitful sleep. Her testimony provided a chilling soundtrack to the murder, a sound that had haunted her for 28 years, the final, brutal punctuation of Thomas Callahan's life. Evelyn's statement gave Jenkins the ammunition she needed. The medical examiner's report had specified blunt force trauma from a heavy, flat-surfaced object. Jenkins theorized the murder weapon was likely an item of opportunity, something from the cemetery itself. A tool. She and her team secured a warrant and began a meticulous grid-by-grid search of every maintenance shed, crypt, and storage building on the cemetery grounds, focusing on tools from the 1980s. It was a search for a ghost, an object that had likely been moved, cleaned, or discarded decades ago. But Jenkins operated on the principle that killers, especially arrogant ones like Bishop and Brody, often get careless. They had the cover of a hurricane, believing any evidence would be washed away, but they may have overlooked one small detail in their haste. In the back corner of the oldest, most dilapidated tool shed, buried under a pile of rotted canvas tarps and discarded equipment, a young SBI technician found it. It was a heavy, cast-iron mallet, the kind stonemasons used for setting headstones into the ground. Its wooden handle was dark with age and rot, and the iron head was covered in a thick crust of rust and hardened soil. To a casual observer, it was just another piece of forgotten junk. But to the forensic team, it was a relic of profound interest. They carefully bagged it as evidence, the air in the small shed thick with a sense of grim discovery. They were holding a piece of the night that Thomas Callahan died, a silent, iron witness to his final, violent moments. The forensics lab confirmed their hopes with chilling precision. Using advanced imaging techniques, they found microscopic traces of organic material trapped deep within the pitted, rusted surface of the mallet's head. The DNA was too degraded after nearly 3 decades of exposure to provide a definitive match, but the blood type was consistent with Thomas Callahan's. The final, irrefutable link, however, came from the soil analysis. The unique composition of minerals and organic matter found caked on the mallet and its handle was a perfect match to the soil samples taken from the clandestine grave in the abandoned section of the cemetery. There was no doubt they had found the murder weapon, a tool of creation used for an act of brutal destruction. With a sworn eyewitness testimony and the recovered murder weapon, the investigation exploded into the public view. Search warrants were served at the homes of Warren Bishop and the retired Sheriff Brody, an unthinkable event in a town they had ruled for a generation. The local news, which had previously treated the story as a historical curiosity, now ran front-page headlines about a murder investigation targeting Havenwood's most prominent citizens. The wall of silence that had protected them for decades crumbled overnight. The power they had wielded for so long began to evaporate under the harsh glare of state-level scrutiny. Their attempts to use their local influence were met with polite but firm resistance from the SBI, making them realize, perhaps for the first time, that they were no longer in control of the narrative. The conflict had now escalated into an open war. Jenkins had everything she needed to bring Bishop and Brody in for official, high-pressure interrogations. The case was no longer about uncovering the past. It was about forcing a confession or building a case so airtight that a jury would have no choice but to convict. For Mike, the swift, dramatic turn of events was both terrifying and deeply vindicating. He was no longer just a son seeking answers. He was the central figure in a battle for the very soul of his town. The quiet caretaker had, by unearthing a single key, forced a reckoning that was decades overdue. The final confrontation was imminent, and Havenwood held its breath, waiting to see if the powerful men who had built the town would be the ones to finally tear it down. The air in the SBI's temporary command post, set up in the Havenwood Community Center, was thick with a suffocating, silent tension. Detective Sarah Jenkins knew this was the fulcrum on which the entire case would turn. She had Warren Bishop and a visibly agitated Sheriff Brody in separate interrogation rooms, a classic prisoner's dilemma designed to shatter their decades-long pact of silence. The strategy was simple: isolate, pressure, and break the weaker link. She chose to start with Brody. He was the soldier, the enforcer. A man accustomed to following orders, not giving them. As she walked toward his room, the hum of the building's air conditioning sounded like a rising scream. Outside, a small crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces a mixture of disbelief and morbid curiosity, watching the twin pillars of their community finally being called to account for the sins buried beneath their town's prosperous facade. Jenkins entered the small beige room and sat opposite Sheriff Brody. The space was deliberately sterile, offering no distractions, just 2 chairs and a steel table between them. She began not with accusations, but with a calm, methodical recitation of the facts, her voice a steady, unyielding drone. She laid out photographs on the table one by one. Evelyn May's house, with its clear line of sight to the cemetery road. The pages of Thomas Callahan's ledger, with Brody's initials next to entries about intimidation. And finally, a high-resolution, clinical image of the rusted stonemason's mallet. Brody's face remained a mask of hardened denial, but his hands, resting on his knees below the table, were clenched into white-knuckled fists. He was a cornered animal, projecting defiance while every instinct screamed that the trap he had evaded for 28 years had finally snapped shut around him. In the adjacent room, Warren Bishop projected an aura of serene, almost bored indignation. He sat with his back straight, his expensive suit unwrinkled, looking more like a chairman of the board than a murder suspect. He treated the detective questioning him with a patronizing condescension, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial nonsense, the ramblings of a senile old woman, and the desperate theories of an overzealous, out-of-town cop. "My dear man," Bishop said, a thin, dismissive smile playing on his lips, "Havenwood is what it is today because I made difficult decisions." Thomas Callahan was a good man, but he was a sentimentalist, an obstacle to progress. He couldn't see the future we were trying to build. His unfortunate accident during that storm was a tragedy, yes, but a tragedy that allowed this town to finally move forward, to thrive. His words were a chilling, implicit confession, cloaked in the language of civic duty. Jenkins ignored Brody's blustering denials and leaned forward, lowering her voice, making the sterile room feel claustrophobic and intimate. "Let's talk about the sound, Sheriff," she said softly. "The medical examiner said the first blow would have been a dull, wet thud, like a heavy sack of grain hitting the floor. But it was raining, wasn't it? So maybe it sounded different. Maybe it was a sharp crack that was swallowed by the thunder. Did you hear it? Or did you just feel the vibration through the ground as his knees buckled? You were standing right there. You must have felt the rain on your face, the mud sucking at your boots. You can't forget a thing like that. No matter how many years go by, the sound of a man's life ending stays with you, doesn't it?" Bishop, meanwhile, continued his calculated performance of untouchable authority. He spoke of his legacy, of the library and the new hospital wing that bore his name, framing himself as the town's benevolent patriarch. "You're chasing ghosts," he told the detective, "and in the process, you're tearing this community apart over something that happened a generation ago. Some things are best left buried." That's a lesson in pragmatism, not criminality. He was not just denying the crime, he was justifying it, repositioning a brutal murder as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. His arrogance was a fortress, built over decades of unchecked power and the complicit silence of a town that had benefited from his sins. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was beyond reproach, a man who had earned the right to write his own history and his own laws. Jenkins watched Brody's composure begin to fray at the edges. His gaze kept darting to the photograph of the mallet. She slid the evidence bag containing the actual tool onto the center of the table. The heavy iron head made a dull, definitive thud as it landed. "We found this buried under a tarp in the old maintenance shed," she said, her voice cutting through his defenses. "The soil composition embedded in the rust is a perfect match for the soil in the clandestine grave, and the forensics team found microscopic traces of your DNA. on the wooden handle. "It's degraded, but it's there." It was a calculated bluff, a shot in the dark, but Brody's face went pale. The last vestiges of his defiance crumbled, replaced by the raw, undisguised terror of a man who could feel the cold steel of a prison door closing on him. Outside the interrogation rooms, Mike Callahan paced the sterile hallway like a caged animal. The muffled sounds of voices from behind the closed doors were an indistinct torture, each second stretching into an eternity of waiting. He reached into his pocket, his fingers closing around the cold, familiar shape of the chapel key. This small piece of iron had become an anchor, a tangible link to the father he barely remembered, and the truth he was now so agonizingly close to uncovering. He could feel the weight of 28 years of silence, of unanswered questions, of a grief that had no place to rest. He wasn't just waiting for a confession that would lead to an arrest. He was waiting for the end of a story that had haunted every single day of his life. A story that began with a hurricane and was about to end in this quiet, fluorescent-lit hallway. Brody's voice, when he finally spoke, was a dry, cracking whisper, the sound of a dam breaking. "It was Bishop," he rasped, his eyes fixed on the evidence bag on the table. "He called me that night. Said Callahan was going to the state authorities with his little notebook, that he was going to ruin everything we'd built. Warren said we had to talk to him, to reason with him. But I knew what he meant. He was trying to cast himself as a reluctant follower, a subordinate caught in the orbit of a more powerful, more ruthless man. It was the first crack in the conspiracy, the first time in nearly 3 decades that one of the killers had uttered the other's name in connection with the crime. The wall of silence was beginning to collapse under the weight of the truth. Jenkins saw the opening and pressed her advantage, her voice sharp and unforgiving. "Reason with him? You ambushed him in the dark, Sheriff. You held a flashlight while your boss committed murder. Don't you dare try to sell me the story that you were just an innocent bystander. Right now, Warren Bishop is in the room next door, a man who has spent his entire life making sure someone else takes the fall. He is crafting a story that puts this mallet in your hand, and your hand alone. You have one chance, right now, to tell me exactly what happened, your version, or you will spend the rest of your life in a cage, protecting a man who would have forgotten your name before the cell door even slammed shut." The confession came in a flood of disjointed, horrifying images. Brody described confronting Thomas Callahan near the old chapel, the wind and rain lashing around them. Thomas refused their offer of a bribe, his face set with a quiet, unshakable integrity. He said he wouldn't stand by while they desecrated the cemetery. "Warren," he just snapped. Brody stammered, his eyes wide with the memory. He grabbed the mallet from the tool cart. I grabbed Callahan from behind, held his arms. I didn't think he'd actually do it, but he swung it, again and again. The sound. God, the sound. He buried his face in his hands, his body racked with tremors. The tough guy facade of the old sheriff finally dissolving into the pathetic reality of a terrified old man, haunted by the ghost of the man he helped murder. Through his choked sobs, Brody revealed one final critical detail. After it was done, we dragged him to the old grounds. As we were covering the grave, Warren fumbled in his pocket for a cigarette. He dropped his lighter. It was a silver Zippo, a gift from the town council in '82, had his initials engraved on it. He was in such a panic he didn't see it fall. I kicked some dirt over it with my boot. I was too scared to pick it up. It has to still be there, just a few feet from the grave. It was the missing piece, the irrefutable physical evidence that would tie Warren Bishop directly to the crime scene, a small metallic object that had lain dormant in the earth for 28 years, a silent testament to a killer's carelessness in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. Detective Jenkins emerged from the interrogation room, her face grim but triumphant. She found Mike still pacing the hallway, his face etched with anxiety. She met his gaze, and in that moment, he knew. She didn't need to say a word. The years of uncertainty, of living with a ghost, of tending a grave he never knew existed, all came crashing down on him. "We have a full confession," Jenkins said, her voice soft but firm. and we know where to find the final piece of evidence to convict Bishop. It's over, Mike." A wave of relief so profound, it felt like a physical blow washed over him, followed immediately by the sharp, searing pain of the truth. He leaned against the wall for support, the chapel key in his pocket feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds, its purpose finally, and tragically, fulfilled. The final scene of the confrontation was a study in contrasts. Armed with Brody's confession and the location of the lighter, a team was dispatched to the cemetery. Jenkins walked into Warren Bishop's interrogation room. The old man looked up, his condescending smile still in place, but his eyes held a flicker of uncertainty. He saw Sheriff Brody being led down the hall in handcuffs, his head bowed in defeat. In that instant, Bishop's fortress of arrogance crumbled into dust. He understood he had been betrayed, abandoned by the man who had been his loyal dog for 40 years. Jenkins didn't speak. She simply placed the arrest warrant on the table in front of him. "Warren Bishop," she said, her voice ringing with the cold authority of justice finally served, "you are under arrest for the murder of Thomas Callahan." The great man of Havenwood was finally and irrevocably brought down. The news of the arrests of Warren Bishop and Sheriff Brody swept through Havenwood like a shockwave, shattering the carefully constructed mythology the town had built for itself over 3 decades. The benevolent patriarch and his loyal enforcer were not heroes who had guided the community through a storm, but murderers who had used it as cover for their crimes. Overnight, the town's main diner, once a place for idle gossip about bake sales and high school football, became a tense forum for hushed, disbelieving conversations. Faces that had once shown deference and respect for Bishop now reflected a mixture of confusion, betrayal, and a dawning, sickening realization. The prosperity they had all enjoyed, the very foundation of modern Havenwood, was built upon the bones of an honest man, and the entire community was now an unwilling accomplice to a story they had chosen not to question for far too long. Acting on Brody's confession, Detective Jenkins dispatched a forensic team back to the dark, overgrown corner of the cemetery. Under the stark glare of portable floodlights that cut through the pre-dawn gloom, they began a meticulous, grid-based search of the area around Thomas Callahan's clandestine grave. The work was slow and delicate, a painstaking archaeological dig into the events of a single, violent night. After less than an hour of carefully scraping away layers of compacted soil and leaf litter, a technician's trowel made a soft metallic sound. With a brush, she gently cleared the remaining dirt to reveal the tarnished silver of a Zippo lighter. When Jenkins held it in her gloved hand, turning it over to see the elegantly engraved initials, WB, she knew it was over. This was the final, irrefutable link, a killer's careless mistake, a small piece of vanity that had waited patiently in the dark earth to deliver its damning testimony. The trial was a somber, media-saturated spectacle that laid bare the town's corrupted soul. Sheriff Brody, a diminished figure in a cheap suit, took the stand as the state's star witness. His voice, stripped of its former authority, was a low, trembling monotone as he recounted the murder in excruciating detail. He described the ambush in the storm, Thomas Callahan's refusal to be bought, and the chilling, almost casual way Warren Bishop had picked up the stonemason's mallet. He detailed the brutal, repeated blows, the sound they made, and the frantic, clumsy effort to hide the body as the hurricane raged around them. The courtroom was held in a state of horrified silence as the ghost of Thomas Callahan was finally given a voice, and the town's foundational myth was systematically and brutally dismantled by one of its own architects. When Warren Bishop took the stand in his own defense, he was the picture of defiant arrogance. He attempted to charm the jury with the same paternalistic charisma that had served him for a generation, painting himself as a visionary leader and Thomas Callahan as a naive obstacle to progress. He spoke of difficult choices made for the greater good, framing his actions not as murder, but as a regrettable but necessary act of civic triage. But the magic was gone. Under the harsh, unforgiving lights of the courtroom, his folksy charm seemed reptilian, his justifications hollow and self-serving. The jury saw not a town father, but a predator, a man so consumed by his own power that he believed he had the right to erase any man who stood in his way. His performance was not a defense. It was the final desperate monologue of a fallen tyrant. The moment the jury foreman uttered the word guilty, a collective audible gasp filled the courtroom. For Mike Callahan, sitting in the front row, the verdict wasn't a moment of triumphant victory, but of profound, bone-deep release. It was as if a physical weight he had been carrying on his shoulders his entire life had suddenly dissolved, leaving him feeling light and strangely empty. The decades of unanswered questions, of a grief without a grave, of a life lived in the shadow of an unknown tragedy, had finally come to an end. He watched as Warren Bishop's mask of serene composure finally shattered, his face contorting for a single, fleeting second into a mask of pure, venomous rage, before the bailiffs led him away in handcuffs. The great man of Havenwood was gone, reduced to a common murderer, his legacy turning to ash before his very eyes. Justice, though delayed by 28 years, was swift and absolute. Warren Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate that stripped him of the one thing he valued above all else: his power and influence. He died of a heart attack in a state penitentiary 4 years later, his name already a cautionary tale, a footnote in the revised history of the town he once ruled. Sheriff Brody, in exchange for his testimony, received a reduced sentence of 15 years for his role as an accomplice. He served 12 before being released on parole, returning not to Havenwood, but to a life of quiet, anonymous shame in another state, forever haunted by the memory of his own cowardice and the sound of the mallet striking flesh in the driving rain. The convictions forced a painful but necessary reckoning in Havenwood. The town could no longer hide behind the comforting lie of its own resilience. The revelation that its modern prosperity was financed by a murder conspiracy triggered a crisis of identity. Long-held assumptions were questioned, and a deep-seated distrust of the old power structures took root. A new generation of civic leaders emerged, ones who campaigned on platforms of transparency and accountability, vowing to never again allow the town's moral compass to be compromised by the ambitions of a few powerful men. The story of Thomas Callahan became a foundational lesson, a permanent reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way to the surface. Havenwood began the slow, arduous process of rebuilding its identity on a foundation of honesty rather than deceit. For Evelyn May, the trial was a final, terrifying act of courage that ultimately brought her a profound sense of peace. Seeing Bishop and Brody held to account freed her from the prison of fear and guilt she had inhabited for nearly 3 decades. In the weeks after the verdict, she and Mike spent a quiet afternoon in her rose garden, the scent of lavender hanging in the air. She confessed that her greatest regret was not her fear, but her silence, and she thanked him for having the strength to unearth a truth she had helped keep buried. Her testimony had not only been crucial to the case, but it also allowed her to reclaim the final years of her life, no longer a hostage to a memory from a stormy night long ago. Her story became a quiet testament to the immense burden of secrets and the liberating power of finally speaking them aloud. The mystery of Samuel Peterson was also finally laid to rest. The investigation revealed he was a man with a history of financial trouble whom Bishop had used for small, deniable tasks, paying him cash to sign documents he didn't understand. He was a minor, almost insignificant player, but his conscience had clearly tormented him. Terminally ill and with nothing left to lose, he had arranged for the key, which Bishop had likely given him long ago as a tool for some menial task and forgotten, to be placed in his casket. It was a final, desperate act of atonement, a message from a man who knew he was a coward in life, but hoped to find some measure of courage in death. Mike ensured Peterson was reinterred with dignity, his role in the saga understood not as that of an accomplice, but as a tragic, remorseful messenger. Weeks after the trial, Mike finally gave his father the burial he had been denied for 28 years. It was a small, private ceremony on a crisp autumn afternoon. The only people in attendance were Mike and Detective Sarah Jenkins, who had become a quiet, steadfast source of support. The old, impersonal bronze plaque near the chapel was removed. In its place, a simple granite headstone was erected in the Callahan family plot, its surface freshly carved. It read, "Thomas Callahan, beloved husband and father, a man of unshakable integrity, finally at peace." As Mike stood before the grave, he felt the last vestiges of the cold, hollow ache that had defined his life being replaced by a quiet warmth, a sense of closure that was both deeply painful and profoundly healing. His father was no longer a ghost. He was home. The resolution of the mystery did not erase the sorrow of a childhood spent without a father, but it fundamentally transformed the nature of Mike's grief. The gnawing uncertainty and simmering anger that had been his constant companions were gone, replaced by a deep, quiet pride. He now understood the man his father truly was, not a victim of a random act of nature, but a hero who had made the ultimate sacrifice for his principles. He had died protecting the sanctity of the ground he was sworn to care for, a truth more powerful than any lie. Mike no longer felt defined by his father's absence, but was instead inspired by his legacy. He could finally look at the old photographs in the cottage not with a sense of loss, but with a feeling of profound and enduring connection. In the aftermath, Mike made the conscious choice to remain the caretaker of the Havenwood Municipal Cemetery. The job that had once felt like a self-imposed penance, a way to stay tethered to a painful past, now felt like a sacred duty. He was no longer just a groundskeeper. He was the keeper of the town's true history, a guardian of its most important lesson. The cemetery was no longer a landscape of ghosts and unanswered questions. It had become a place of profound peace, a sanctuary where the stories of the past were honored, and the truth was allowed to rest, undisturbed. His work took on a new meaning, each trimmed hedge and polished headstone, an act of devotion to the integrity his father had embodied. Months later, on a cool evening, Mike walked his final rounds as dusk settled over the cemetery. He paused at his father's grave, the new grass on the plot growing thick and green. He reached into his pocket, and his fingers closed around the old, wrought-iron chapel key. He held it for a moment, its weight familiar and comforting, a relic of a journey that had led him from the darkness of the past into the light of truth. He then continued to the main gate, but instead of using the old key, he pulled out a new, modern one and turned it in the lock. The sharp, definitive click echoed in the quiet air. He was no longer a prisoner of this place, but its willing, peaceful guardian, a man who had finally locked the door on his past and was ready to walk freely into his own future. The seasons turned, and the raw wound of the trial began to scar over, leaving the town of Havenwood forever changed. For Mike Callahan, the cemetery was no longer a landscape of ghosts, but a garden of quiet truths. He walked the familiar paths, not with the heavy tread of a man shackled to the past, but with the lighter step of a guardian who had fulfilled his most sacred duty. The air itself seemed different, cleansed of the oppressive weight of a decades-old secret. The weeping willows no longer whispered accusations. Their branches swayed with a gentle, rustling peace. He found a strange, profound comfort in the familiar routines, trimming the hedges, polishing the headstones. Tasks that once felt like a penance now felt like a prayer, a quiet tribute to the man whose integrity had finally been brought into the light. The silence of the place was no longer empty. It was full, resonant with a story told and a justice served. Havenwood, stripped of its benevolent tyrant, was forced into a painful but necessary adolescence. The town's prosperity, once a source of civic pride, was now viewed with a certain suspicion, its foundations forever tainted by the crime that had enabled it. The fall of Warren Bishop had created a power vacuum, and into that void stepped a new generation of leaders, wary of the old ways and vocal in their calls for transparency. Town meetings, once sleepy procedural affairs, became lively debates about the future. People began to question everything, from zoning laws to municipal contracts, their collective innocence shattered. The community was fractured, and trust was a currency in short supply. But in that brokenness, there was an opportunity for something more honest to grow. The town was learning, slowly and painfully, that a history built on a lie is a house built on sand, destined to collapse under the weight of its own deceit. Mike himself had become an unlikely, quiet symbol of this new era. He was no longer the solitary, almost invisible caretaker, a man defined by his grief. The townspeople now greeted him with a mixture of awe and a deep, unspoken respect. They saw in him not just the son of a murdered hero, but the man who had possessed the courage to pull the thread that unraveled everything. He found he could meet their gazes without flinching, could engage in small talk at the local market without the familiar shroud of sorrow weighing him down. He was still a quiet man, his nature unchanged, but the quiet was no longer born of pain. It was the calm of a man who had faced the darkest chapter of his family's story and had not been broken by it. He had walked through the fire of the past and emerged not unscathed but whole, finally free to be more than just his father's son. The physical artifacts of the long investigation found their final resting places. The small leather-bound ledger, its secrets now laid bare for the world to see, was placed in a box with his father's other belongings, a closed chapter in a finished book. The rusted stonemason's mallet remained in an SBI evidence locker, a permanent, silent monument to a brutal crime. But the key, the old wrought-iron chapel key with its faded yellow ribbon, Mike kept. He cleaned the rust from its surface and hung it on a small hook inside the cottage, just by the door. It was no longer a trigger for pain or a symbol of a mystery. It had become a reminder, a testament to the fact that the smallest, most forgotten object can hold the power to unlock the most heavily guarded truths, and that a father's love could echo through time, leaving a clue that only a son's heart could recognize. He visited his father's grave often, especially as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. He no longer came to mourn what he had lost, but to connect with what he had found. He finally understood the quiet strength of Thomas Callahan, the unshakable moral compass that had made him an obstacle to men like Bishop. His father wasn't a fool who had stumbled into danger. He was a soldier who had refused to retreat from his post, a man who chose integrity over survival. He would sometimes speak to the granite headstone in a low voice, sharing small details of his day, feeling a sense of companionship that had been denied to him for most of his life. The ghost that had haunted him for 28 years was finally at peace, and in that peace, Mike found his own, a son's quiet communion with a father's heroic legacy. The ripples of the Havenwood case spread far beyond the town's borders. Detective Jenkins kept in touch, sending Mike an occasional email. She told him that the methods of corruption detailed in his father's ledger, the use of shell corporations, straw buyers, and manipulated zoning laws, were not unique to Warren Bishop. The SBI had launched a wider, state-level task force to investigate similar patterns of corruption in other small, seemingly peaceful towns that had experienced sudden, inexplicable economic booms. Thomas Callahan's meticulous record-keeping had become a Rosetta Stone for deciphering the language of small-town graft. His death, a tragedy meant to bury a secret, had ironically become the very thing that exposed a much larger network of deceit. The quiet caretaker, in his quest for personal justice, had inadvertently armed law enforcement with a blueprint to unearth sins buried all across the state, a legacy of truth far greater than he could have imagined. The task force began to uncover connections that were both shocking and deeply unsettling. Names from Bishop's past business dealings appeared in the land records of other counties, linked to other powerful figures who had operated with impunity for decades. It became clear that the corruption in Havenwood was not an isolated cancer, but a symptom of a much wider disease, a network of powerful men who treated towns and their people like pieces on a chessboard. The story of one murdered caretaker was beginning to look like a single, bloody chapter in a vast, unwritten encyclopedia of greed and power. The evidence suggested that Bishop and Brody were not the masterminds, but merely successful franchise owners in a much larger, more sinister enterprise. And what they were beginning to uncover suggested that the Havenwood conspiracy was just the tip of a very large, very dark iceberg. And this was just the beginning of something much bigger. One crisp autumn evening, Mike walked his final rounds, the air sharp with the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves. He arrived at the main gate, the wrought iron cool beneath his hand. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple, casting a warm, benevolent light over the rows of silent headstones. He took a deep breath, the peacefulness of the moment settling deep into his bones. This place, which had once been the epicenter of his pain and the prison of his past, was now simply his charge, a quiet corner of the world he was proud to protect. He looked out beyond the gates, toward the twinkling lights of the town, seeing not a community of secrets and lies, but a place struggling toward a more honest future, a place he was finally and truly a part of. The long shadow of 1984 had finally receded. He turned the new lock, the decisive click echoing in the twilight stillness. It was a sound of finality, of a door closing not on a memory, but on a chapter of grief. He turned and walked toward the small caretaker's cottage, its windows glowing with a welcoming light, leaving the dead to their peaceful slumber. The story of his father had been one of integrity, a quiet and stubborn refusal to look away from wrongdoing, no matter the cost. It was a legacy Mike now carried, not as a burden, but as a compass, for he had learned the cemetery's most profound lesson, that some things can never be truly buried. Truth, like a stubborn seed planted in the darkest earth, will always fight its way through the dirt and the stone, stretching relentlessly, patiently, until it finally breaks through into the sun, demanding its rightful place in the light.